Thank you for joining the Lakeside Light Podcast. It's light to help you see your way, and a light version of our full televised Sunday services, which you can find on our website at lakesidechurch.org. This audio podcast is a weekly sermon message of intellectual, spiritual, and sometimes humorous nourishment for the road. Enjoy.
Okay, I don't know if you've noticed, but Cracker Barrel has had their Christmas stuff out since August. And I'm hoping that gives me a little leeway this morning to talk about a favorite Christmas movie of mine. We're not trying to get a head start on Advent. The truth is, when I read this passage from James, whenever I turn to teaching of James on wisdom, my thoughts always wander off to that old Frank Capra movie, It's a Wonderful Life. How many of you have seen it? Okay. The rest of you, get on the ball. The story circles around two central characters living in Bedford Falls, small town America. Jimmy Stewart plays George Bailey, a nice guy whose only aspiration in life is to get out of Bedford Falls and to make it to the big city. But because he is a nice guy, things keep coming up that hold him in Bedford Falls. First, for various reasons, he puts his little brother through college ahead of himself, and then he never gets his own chance. Later, when Dad dies, George stays home to take over the family business, not because he really wants to be a banker, but because he believes this town needs this bank, and he doesn't want to see it closed. You get the picture. The other important character in the movie is Mr. Potter, played to malicious perfection by Lionel Barrymore. Mr. Potter is crotchety, greedy, heartless, ruthless, and he practically owns Bedford Falls. The only thorn in Potter's side is George Bailey. George owns the other bank in town, so he is Potter's competitor. Even worse, instead of using people to build up his bank, George Bailey uses his bank to build up people. He loans money to folks who don't qualify. When his neighbors have financial troubles, George Bailey extends their loans. He finances a development of decent, affordable housing at no profit to himself. George Bailey, truth be told, never makes much money. The bank just gets by, but George does a lot of good. And Mr. Potter hates George Bailey. He hates him for his competition. He hates him for his sentimental business dealings. He hates him just because of who he is, a sap, a sucker, a nice guy. Potter makes it his personal goal in life to destroy George Bailey, but that turns out to be easier said than done, because it's hard to cheat an honest man. It's hard to corrupt a man who doesn't long for power over others. And it's hard to buy a man who doesn't love money. All of Potter's strategies fail until one Christmas Eve, when one of George Bailey's employees innocently loses a bundle of cash from the bank, a large bundle of cash. And if the money isn't recovered quickly, the bank will be closed, George Bailey will be disgraced, and he will be sent to jail. The stakes are high. Now, by cinematic happenstance, Mr. Potter is the one who finds the misplaced bundle of money. He does not, of course, turn it in. Instead, he watches gleefully while George Bailey races all over town, searching frantically for the money, becoming increasingly desperate, until, with every hope dashed, George Bailey goes to Mr. Potter and asks, begs, pleads to borrow just enough money to keep the bank afloat until he can sort things out. It is the most triumphant moment in Potter's twisted, selfish life as he refuses to loan a penny to George Bailey. While Potter gloats, George Bailey heads for the river, planning to throw himself in and drown. It's a Wonderful Life is a study of two kinds of wisdom. It really is. What the letter of James calls the wisdom from above and the wisdom from below. The wisdom from below is crafty and cagey and cunning. Maybe, if we wanted to be polite, we would call it shrewdness. James has nothing good to say about this worldly wisdom, this shrewdness. He says it is earthly. He says it is unspiritual. Finally, he says it is in fact devilish. This wisdom from below is characterized by envy and selfish ambition. I will take my slice of the pie first, thank you, and I'll take the biggest slice. And if you're not really watching closely, I might take your slice too. In short, sadly, this is the way much of the world works so much of the time. Now, I really try not to be cynical. But the truth is, we simply take so much of this for granted. I mean, one example, money talks, right? And whoever has the most money generally has the most influence. We're not even surprised by this. This is the way we expect the world to work, isn't it? By the wisdom from below. In real life, we would probably respect Mr. Potter as a self-made man who's built an empire out of nothing and made his mark on the world, even if he did have to walk on a whole bunch of people on the way. But there is another way to think and another way to live. The way of George Bailey, although I won't say he invented it. The way of the true wisdom that comes from God. Now, James takes some pains to describe this wisdom from above, maybe because we don't see it often enough to recognize it. And the words he uses are really interesting. James says that this wisdom from above is pure. And the deeper meaning of the Greek word in the background there means pure enough to approach God. Living the kind of life that we can offer to God without embarrassment, without shame, without apology. James says that this wisdom from above is peaceable, meaning that it seeks right relationships. It doesn't focus on me, it focuses on you and me. Trying to have healthy relationships with each other and with God. It is pure, it is peaceable, it is gentle, says James. The word there in Greek means committed to justice and fairness that go beyond the requirements of the law. Think about that. The wisdom that James teaches is a wisdom that bends over backwards to be fair to people, even going the second mile when needed in order to be fair. The wisdom from above, says James, is full of mercy. Now, when the Greeks used this word mercy in the first century, they meant sympathy for someone who is in trouble through no fault of their own. And we know that's an easy sympathy to feel, right? You see somebody who really hasn't done anything wrong and the bottom has fallen out and their life is a mess, of course we feel sorry for them. But New Testament Christians took that word and they stretched it. They stretched the meaning of the word. And so for early Christians, mercy meant sympathy toward people in trouble, even if they had brought that trouble on themselves. Sympathy toward people who are in a bad place, even if it is their own fault. That's a deep kind of mercy. It's the kind of mercy God shows to you and me, right? Because if God was not merciful toward people who had made their own mess, well, theologically speaking, we'd all be in a hell of a mess. And notice also that in this passage, when James talks about mercy, he links it with good fruits. In other words, James isn't talking about sympathetic feelings that stop there. He's talking about having the kind of mercy that moves us to try to help somebody else. Moves us to try to do something. Mercy with its work clothes on. Mercy with its sleeves rolled up. You see the kind of mercy James is talking about, this wisdom from above. Shrewdness looks for how I can get ahead. Wisdom looks for how we can all get ahead. And I'm still convinced that kind of wisdom is not as common in the world as it ought to be, and maybe with good reason. Because at some point, if you're going to take this seriously, you have to ask yourself, does that really work? Can you actually live that way and survive in a dog-eat-dog world? Is it really a wonderful life if we treat others with love and mercy and compassion? Really? Well, not surprisingly, the movie ends happily ever after. It is a Frank Capra movie. George doesn't commit suicide, the bank is saved, and all is well. And George Bailey's loving, gentle wisdom, his way of doing things, brings him a circle of good friends, a good family, a good conscience, a good name, and yes, a good life. And I dare say that half a century later, at least some of us are still watching this corny, sentimental movie because it rings true, or at least it rings with something that we very much want to be true. That if you treat the world right, the world will reciprocate. If you're there for people in their time of need, they will be there for you in your time of need. Now, I don't mean this in any way pejoratively, but really, that's an Old Testament way of looking at the world. That is the theology of Deuteronomy. Do well and God will bless you. Do wrong and you will suffer for it. It's very straight up, very cut and dried. It is the homemade theology of the book of Proverbs. Show up for your neighbor when they need help, and they'll show up for you when you need help. And frankly, no, it's not always true. But, in my opinion, it is true often enough to make it a pretty good bet and a pretty good way to live. The New Testament takes us a little deeper. One day in Capernaum, Jesus sits down with his disciples and he says, "Well, we were on the way here. While I was explaining to you that I had come in order to suffer and lay down my life on a cross, when I was explaining to you that the reason the Son of Man has come is to die for a lost world, when I was explaining this to you, what were you all talking about? Because I could hear you talking and whispering." And at this point, the disciples, and they were well versed in this, at this point, the disciples all stare at their sandals and they play dumb because they were talking about who gets the top position in the kingdom of God when it gets here. Which one of us disciples is doing the best job and we'll get to be the CEO? And no, they don't want to admit that. And Jesus doesn't force them to. Instead, Jesus finds a little kid wandering around, and this says something about the ministry of Jesus. Little kids often seem to be wandering around. He finds a little kid wandering around and wraps his arms around this child and says, "You know, guys, I need you to understand how this works. You will never get ahead in God's kingdom by putting yourselves first. No, in God's kingdom, it is just the opposite of the kind of wisdom you would expect. You have to put the little people first, the helpless people, the penniless people, the powerless people, the people who cannot repay you or do a thing to help you in life, people like little kids. And Jesus doesn't promise them that this way of life will lead to financial prosperity or popularity or a nice home. He doesn't say that they won't have those things, but neither does he guarantee that they will. All he promises is this: whenever you welcome one of these people, one of these insignificant, little, overlooked people, whenever you welcome one of them, you have welcomed me. And when you welcome me, you welcome the God who sent me. Well, there you have it. I have to choose for me and you have to choose for you. Personally, I think Frank Capra and the Old Testament teachers had it mostly right. Mostly right. If we live by the wisdom from above, if we treat people the way we'd want to be treated, things will work out. Usually. Maybe even mostly. And when we practice the wisdom from above and things don't work out, I'm willing to trust Jesus for the rest. Jesus, the New Testament teacher, who says that a life filled with love, for the least and smallest and most expendable, a life filled with love turns out to be a life also filled with God. And in my book, yeah, that is a wonderful life. To God alone be the glory. Amen.
The Lakeside Light Podcast is a copyrighted production of Lakeside Presbyterian Church. Visit our website at lakesidechurch.org for more information. Have a great week.